I'm actually very grateful to Balaji because Balaji has really created this interesting hype around a concept that was very little discussed and which didn't have an ontological reference. And so now we have this concept in the air and everyone is talking about it. And now it's fantastic because I don't think if I would have managed to create this big wave, but now that the big wave is there, we can surf on the wave of Balaji in order to, again, hijack it and try to bring it, at least provide an alternative path so that people can choose which type of infrastructure will they rather play with.
Welcome to the Regeneration Will Be Funded. My name is Matthew Monahan, and in this series, we're exploring the intersections of regenerative finance, technology, and our living planet. Created with Ma Earth, you can find all of our conversations and more at maearth.com. Thanks for joining us. Today's guest is Primavera De Filippi. Primavera is a brilliant researcher who's been in the crypto and Ethereum space for a long time. And in today's conversation, we talk about why blockchain is such a great place for research and experimentation, especially around governance. We go into this meme or term that Primavera helped coin, extitutional theory. It's something that's kind of hard to unhear and is making waves in different Web3 circles. We also talk about Primavera's ideas around impact NFTs and how new advancements in NFTs can help raise money for public goods. We discuss various nuances around financial speculation, universal basic income experiments, and Primavera's critique of the network state. This conversation was recorded in May 2023 at the Eco Weaving Gathering at Wilbur. I hope you get something from it. Primavera De Filippi. We are here today with Primavera De Filippi. Primavera is a researcher, an artist, and activist. Welcome.
Thank you.
So, what do you do?
What do I do? That's a very difficult question. So most of my life is dedicated on exploring how we can actually invent new governance structures in the very broad sense of governance. And I do that with multiple hats, I guess, from the research hat. I'm pretty much focusing, all my research is about how we can design governance structure which are more decentralized, participative, mostly how do we move away from the dominant strategy of competition towards the dominant strategy of cooperation. And so my research is essentially looking at blockchain, mostly because blockchain is kind of this new area in which experimentation is actually possible. There's very little space left in the world in which we can actually experiment with new governance structure because everything is so entrenched. And even existing institutions that want to experiment are afraid because there is too much stake at risk. And so either you experiment with no stake or very low stake, but then it's not a real experimentation. And the blockchain is this very fascinating field because there is sufficiently high stakes because you have real money, economic interest, but also an extreme desire of experimentation with new systems. So that's kind of how I fell into this big hole of blockchain governance.
When was that?
So I started dedicating my whole research to blockchain in late 2013, when when I discovered Ethereum as like something is happening, and I don't know what's happening, but if it is ever to manifest itself into reality, I need to be looking at this. And so I've been looking for a long time. Like I'm a legal scholar, so I've been looking a lot about like what are the legal issues that are raised by digital technologies, and in particular decentralized architecture. So internet, mesh network, Tor, peer-to-peer file sharing, and so forth. And so obviously then, Bitcoin came about, and I was like, oh, that's yet a new decentralized infrastructure that raised amazing legal challenges. But most of the legal challenges were kind of like financial, and with Ethereum, the legal challenges became like legal challenge and legal opportunities. Like here is this whole new plethora of possibilities that have become possible. And so when I encountered this new project before even the launch of Ethereum, I was like, okay, everything else parked. And now I'm just focusing exclusively on this.
Yeah. I mean, I've come across your work in a lot of different contexts. It seems to percolate a lot of people's ideation, and, that people reference your papers, or they kind of reference your work, and whether it was in the P2P contexts, whether it was in the Ethereum world, whether it was in kind of, different economic theories. So you've definitely had an influence in the space, but I have never experienced you like shilling some token or, kind of in the money game as much as kind of the deep theoretics and legal research. Is that a fair characterization?
Yeah, I think my interest in the blockchain is really about governance. So law and governance, of course. Yeah. So I'm more on this side of, which I think many people at the early days were there because of the opportunity for distributed governance, because no one expected that it will ever go that high. And I'm still there. I'm still like, we still have a lot of work to do in order to explore new governance structure, new economic structure. But it's what I really care about, like even when I'm thinking about those new economic models, it's always how do we facilitate cooperation and how do we move away from competition. I think that's kind of like my trajectory in life. My hyperstition is what are all the tools that we have at hand that can help this transition.
Got it. And we've had a couple conversations here with folks, Tony Lai and Jess Angel, and it was referenced that you were the originator of this term extitution. So I'm dying to ask you, like, what is extitution? How did this phrase come about, and what does it mean to you?
Yes, so this is perhaps my favorite word, which I guess we made up. So
I think Jess's exact quote was, "It's definitely Primavera's kink."
Yes, that's my kink. So it's interesting. It's actually the whole research about extitution came about when I was discussing with Jessie Kate and Tony. Jessie Kate, which is extremely interested in space governance, and Tony, everything governance. And it was interesting because I was talking and I was like, why do we enjoy talking so much together, even though I don't know anything about space, you don't know anything about blockchain, what's up, right? And we realized that there is obviously a commonality. There is something very deep that triggers our passion. And we really intentionally were like, let's figure it out. There is obviously something at a lower level of abstraction. Why do I care about blockchain? It's not blockchain per se. It's because governance and what is that particular flavor of governance that really interests me. So that's how extitutional theory came about. It was like trying to figure out the intersection of like all those people that are really passionate about governance for very different areas. And so there has to be a common overarching framework that accommodates everything. And so extitutional theory is basically like providing an alternative lens about how do we look at social dynamics and organization and therefore governance, right? And most of our life we've been taught to look and to understand and to describe social social orders through the institutional framework, which is essentially the reason that we behave in a particular manner is because we have created an institutional scaffolding with roles. So I have to match my role, and then rules that determine the way in which different roles can interact with each other. And so we look at a company, we look at a community, and then we have like roles and rules, sometimes formal, sometimes informal, and that help us understand how people behave, but that also help us shape the behavior of people. So with extitutional theory, we want to provide an alternative lens, which is more about, it's not about roles and rules as like the DNA of the institution, but it's about individual identities and relationship amongst those identities. And both of those lands are incomplete because the reality is that it's always a bit of both and many other reasons. But because the focus is always on the institutional framework, oftentimes we instrumentalize the extitutional dynamics for the service of the institution. Whereas if we start focusing on the extitutional lens, then we do the opposite. Right. We start instrumentalizing the institutional scaffolding, because you do need institutional scaffolding to support the extitutional dynamics or to constrain them if they go in a wrong direction. Okay. And so the idea is really to kind of like use those two, disentangle those institutional dynamics and extitutional dynamics in order to then be able to better understand the interplay between those two, and therefore being able to understand and shape human dynamics by playing those different strings. And what I really care about is that I strongly believe that we have been giving way too much focus on institutions. And so we have this kind of like cycle and vicious circle of over-institutionalization in which when there is a problem within a community, within a group, whatever, we fix the problem by creating rules. But then this rule is fixing maybe is fixing the symptom of the problem, but is oftentimes creating new problems. And now, because it's suffocating the extitutional dynamics. And so instead of like, for instance, like, I don't know, hate speech. So if you have a rule against hate speech, it's because people hate each other. So how do you want to fix the problem? Do you want to create rules against hate speech? Sure, because if people do hate each other, you might want to do that. But then what is the consequence of that? And we forget that we didn't actually solve the problem at the root. So I still hate someone, but I cannot say it. So it's better, but it's also another issue. And I think what's really interesting is to explore the alternative way of solving a problem, which is the process of extitutionalization, which is then focusing more directly on the individuals, on the relationship amongst those individuals, and then trying to accommodate those relationships, trying to fix those relationships, so that eventually the institutional scaffoldings of rules are less necessary, because we have actually solved the problem at the relational fabric. And so basically it's all about like, it's not really identifying anything new that people don't know of. Right. Of course, this is like every good manager knows that you need to do team building and things like this. But it's always in the lens of we need a better company, therefore we need to do team building, as opposed to we are a group of people that want to interact with each other, that have common values and common objectives. Therefore, we need a scaffolding to help these operate, but this is the actual important element.
Right. Yeah, it feels too like, I don't know how you think about this, but it feels like a lot of the other forms of human organizing have been hollowed out, whether it was like our church group or our civic participation in the local community, or, and so our daily life is now dominated by the companies that we work with and maybe the governments that we interact with, and kind of more of at a hegemonic level. And so what you're describing almost to me feels like it's somewhat trying to bring more balance back into different ways of human relating that has become so dominated by only one force. Does that resonate?
Yeah, I mean, I will argue that all those institutions are full of extitutional dynamics too, right? It's like, if you work for a company, there is the institution of the company and there is the extitution of the company.
Of the relationships
of
within.
the relationship.
Right.
And like it's very common that you have like the organigram of like CEO or whatever, and then like all the roles and the rules, But then you also have like the personal relationship that, maybe I'm friend with someone and therefore even if I'm lower in the organigram, I'm actually more powerful. So, and if you don't understand those two diagrams, you don't understand a thing.
I was talking to someone the other day and they were telling me how they knew all the things happening inside of this other company because their roommate worked there, even though those two companies are kind of like competitors and there's probably a lot of rules against sharing information and so forth. But it's like, that's just the reality of what's happening.
Yeah. And to me, it's more about like the alienating aspect of institutions is that it makes people very reduced to a role and therefore fungible. I'm interacting with your role. I'm not interacting with you. And you need to impersonate the role because that's the rule, right? And so all of a sudden, because we focus so much on the roles, then we have to play the role, and we forget to really relate to one another from a very identity and relational basis. And I think a lot of the the loneliness and the alienation and the feeling of like lack of relationality, like no sense of purpose, is essentially due to this extreme focus of institutions that initially for good intentions were designed to actually constrain and suffocate the institutional dynamics because, for instance, like you don't want corruption or you don't want like manipulation, etc. So there is good reasons to actually create scaffoldings that create rules and roles. The problem is when they become so rigid and so strong that we don't even manage to be ourselves anymore because we are playing a role everywhere we are, and people only see us as the role that we play as opposed to as the identity and the person that we really are.
Yeah, I felt so liberated going from Silicon Valley to New Zealand when New Zealand, it's such a small population. People have a lot of different roles that they play. Like it's very common for someone to be doing 2 or 3 things very effectively and at scale, so to speak. Whereas in the United States, I find that, you end up getting a bit more narrowed, a bit more in your lane just to kind of, excel at that one track because you have so many more people. And the consequence is like when you're in social interactions, it's harder to just feel or to pigeonhole someone into just one role because like you're just wearing a lot of different hats. And it starts to create this like blended feeling like we're not just representing our one incentive structure, our one organizational affiliation. So yeah, like in environments where I've been where that's dropped in extitutional kind of vibe, it just feels better. Yeah. It's so interesting to see how the communities around you are using this word so naturally now, like extitutional theory and extitutions and
it has become a very common word, and it's very interesting because when you meet people that to me it has become almost a sense making because if you meet someone that have been impregnated into paying attention to institutional dynamics, which are most of the community we hang out with. As soon as you start saying what extitution and institutional dynamics are, like immediately it's just they accept, they understand, they assimilate, it's given, and then it just becomes a very useful word because instead of like saying a lot of things, you just say extitution and everyone knows exactly what you're referring to. When you speak with people that are very alien to these type of extitutional dynamics that are much more indoctrinated by the institutional framework, they have a hard time understanding what we're talking about. And so it's kind of like it's a test, you want to know if someone is extitutional or not, you tell them about extitutions, and if they understand, they're extitutional, if not, they're not.
Great. Yeah. That's funny. Okay, so you've kind of brought this meme into existence, and I have a feeling it's got a long life ahead of it. You're also kind of memeing something that I know you're not like landing on this name, but you've been describing these concepts around impact NFTs. And so it seems like this is an area of your blockchain research. Can you share more?
Yes. So the idea with impact NFT is like, it's kind of like me being slightly frustrated by the way in which especially as an artist, I've been like exploring blockchain and art for a long time, without doing NFTs, just really like real blockchain art, like smart contract, artistic contraption. And then also I was like, NFT became very popular. Everyone started doing NFT, but it's all very repeating the same system, and like all NFT are the same, just like. And then make 10,000 of them that are all the same. So it was kind of like a frustration. It's like, why are we not innovating at the level of the NFT protocol? Why are we not leveraging the programmability of those new mechanisms of like collectible, or how you want to call them, in order to actually embed specific principles, values within the protocol itself. And so I created like two little babies on that level. One that is called Creative or Remix NFT, which was more using NFTs as a way of actually fighting against digital scarcity, but rather encouraging people to create remixes and derivative works. And the more people collaborate and the more people remix each other, the more all the people that have been part of the remix have an opportunity to collectively benefit economically if any of them get sold, right? So that was one model. And then because of like ecology and whatnot, I designed a different one, which at the time was called Impact NFT, but now everything is Impact NFT, so it needs a new name. But the idea here was like, so again, it's always this game of like, there is a lot of money, up until a few years ago at least, a lot of money going into the NFT space. And what do we do with this money? Right now, it's just pure speculative bubbles and just like rotating amongst the hands of the same speculators and crypto investors. Great, but not that great. Can we actually hijack all these speculative bubble in order to divert some of those funds for good causes, right? And so Impact NFT, the idea is to do exactly that, and particularly for the environment, but it can be any kind of impact, right? And so the idea is that today we have a lot of philanthropists, but not enough, and then we have a lot of like economically motivated people. Some of them are also interested in some impact, but they mostly operate for economic returns. And so with Impact NFT, the idea is, can we actually create philanthropy that actually come with a return on investment, which has the potential to come with a return on investment, and impact-conscious investment opportunities for the people that are more interested in the profit making. And if we manage to actually intersect those, then we can increase immensely the size of philanthropists, because you will always have all the philanthropists anyways, but all of a sudden you also get more of them because of this potential return on investment. And then you have also all the investors, they can choose where to put their money. If you give them an ecological consciousness in addition, then they might choose to invest here rather than there. And so the whole concept around Impact NFT is that you create an NFT, and ideally it's like some artistic, someone that has artistic skills, and associate the NFT with a particular, so I'm using the example of environment, but it can be other things. So for instance, like, I care a lot about Wilbur, and I want to make sure that the biodiversity, the fertility of the ground, the carbon production and so forth is like...
Wilbur being the place we're at right now.
Yes, exactly. So what I can do is I can create some pieces of art, I put them on an NFT, but I deploy them through Impact NFT protocol. And so I associate some data points that are like I need to find the metrics that I want to associate it. So for instance, like the contamination of the hot springs, the fertility of the ground, etc. And so there needs to be an oracle that is collecting this data and record the information. And then I associate the NFT with the data of the oracle. And then I also associate the NFT with a beneficiary. So in this case, probably it will be Wilbur or some NGO that is working towards promoting this environment. And so then what happens is that when I sell the NFT, then the smart contract goes and fetch the data from the oracle and process these data points through a function that will output the vitality index of the natural resources that the NFT is associated with. And then if the vitality index is very high, all is good. I sell it, I get the money, all good. If the vitality index is low, then there is a tax. And the tax is actually reversely proportional to the vitality index. So the worse is the vitality of the natural resources, the higher is the tax. And that means that me as the collector, I have an incentive all of a sudden to make sure that the land is doing well because that will increase my return on selling the NFT, but it will also increase the market value of the NFT because no one wants to buy an NFT that they cannot sell without having 80% of tax. And so all of a sudden what it means is that investors or collectors, they are aligning their economic incentives with the interest of the natural resources. And so this can be used both as a signaling mechanism, which is, look at me, I care about this area, therefore I'm purchasing NFTs that are inherently, whose economic value is intrinsically connected with the vitality of this area. It also facilitates cooperation amongst collectors because, for instance, if you can imagine that this land will be subdivided into different areas, different parcels, and then there is an NFT associated with every parcel, then all of a sudden, I can, as an investor, as a speculator, I can play a very interesting game because I can buy those NFTs when they are cheap because the vitality is low. And then collectively, we can all invest, I don't know, $1,000. If we have 10,000 investors that are investing $1,000, that's a lot of investment that goes into the natural resources to increase the vitality index. And therefore, we all can benefit ideally more than $1,000 by reducing the tax and therefore increasing the market value and therefore selling it to a higher price.
So let me make sure I'm understanding. I think I'm tracking. So I could create this beautiful piece of art inspired by maybe the hot springs here at Wilbur. And then we can attach it to the vitality of the water table where we've had major droughts here in California. And that is measured by an oracle, a data source that is effectively, measuring that water table index. And we say, water table really low, that's a low vitality. Water table high, great. If the water table's high, anytime I sell that NFT of the art that I created, there's very little tax. But if the water table goes really low, then I sell it, then a big tax is incurred and goes to the local NGO who's working on water catchment issues. And what that does is, effectively as a theoretical example, aligns the incentives of, well, we all want the water table to be high. And if I bought it when it's low, then now I have a for-profit incentive. I'm signaling to the market, hey, that I care about water issues here at Wilbur, creating art and connecting the art with the economic incentive. And yeah, it's just kind of more of a collective alignment to the vitality of our ecosystems. Is there anything to add on that?
There's like the last point that is about, there is a point in which when so there is a threshold that should never be crossed. So if it gets really bad, then the NFT gets expropriated from the current owner and sent back to the beneficiary, which means that you pretty much you were not a good steward, right? And the reason it's interesting from an economic perspective is that when you see that the vitality index gets very close to this threshold, it's kind of like the penny stock effect for companies.
Right.
When you have like things that are almost bankrupt, and then you have penny stocks. And then you can have an investor who's like, okay, I'm just going to buy a lot of penny stocks, except that in this case, it's like pennies, NFTs, because they are about to be expropriated anyways. So you buy a lot and then you invest, boost back the Vitality Index, and then you can sell them for like 10 times, 100 times the price that you bought them, right? So it also creates this opportunity for investors that have absolutely no, not necessarily an ecological interest, but pure profit-based interest to actually invest money into nature, because that provides you a new strategy. So it's no longer just about understanding market dynamics. You now have a new game, which is more or less speculative. It's hard to say. Clearly less speculative. Maybe it's hard to predict, but you actually know that you can manipulate, as opposed to like markets, which you're not supposed to try and manipulate. Here, it's actually an incentive. Let's manipulate the external world as a way of actually increasing the profits. So investor can choose to play that game if that's a game that they know how to play, and if they are interested in doing this. So it creates this new speculative game to investors that are profit oriented, and yet the profitable things to do in this case is to actually invest into improving the state of the natural resources that it is associated with.
Got it. Fascinating. And you mentioned like now everything's an impact NFT. I share this kind of like alienation with the overuse of the word impact now. I worked on a project that we called the Global Impact Visa, and this was many years ago now. But now like impact is just so prevalent that it's kind of like, oh, it's not as unique anymore. How do you experience this word impact in your contexts?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's great that people care more and more about impact. I think there's a point in which we need to assess like what impact means, and that's why I think the question of metrics becomes extremely important, and the question of who is measuring those metrics, right? Like, and in the case of impact NFT, it's challenging because some things are objective, some things are less objective, and you always need to trust, because the oracle is a trusted actor. So you always need to trust that the oracle is actually not manipulating the information, that it has like all the proper infrastructure to collect the right information. So I think there is like a big, in all this discourse about impact NFTs, oftentimes we're thinking so much about the protocol. Let's make sure that the protocol works game theoretically, etc. And there's not enough focus on the oracles. And I will say today the big gap in the ecosystem is we don't have enough oracles, trusted oracles, or just oracles in general, that are actually calculating impact. Right? In a way that is, I guess, collectively agreed as being objectively appropriate.
What do you see as the possible solutions to that, or what are the green shoots that you're witnessing for more oracles?
Well, I have strong hopes in Planet.
Yes, our friends at planet.com, Planet Labs.
Yes, I trust them to figure out something there, because I mean they have the data anyway. So
I'll grill Will and Robbie, who I have interviews with them coming up.
Exactly.
Yes.
Please poke them on.
Where is the oracle?
Yes.
Anything else in terms of oracles?
No, I think
So it sounds like part of the theory of change of impact NFTs is that if we have more of a collective incentive alignment amongst investors, speculators, people with economic interests towards, in this case, health of the ecology, but it could also be other social indicators, that is fundamentally good. There's like an incentive alignment. You mentioned kind of, a lot of money going into NFTs, and like, how do we kind of hijack that? I'm curious, like, how the deeper reflection you have about like hijacking the current system and trying to have it meet more harmonious purposes.
Yeah, so I think this becomes more of a philosophical question, but it's about ethical or philosophical, which is there is an and the and is actually that the means that we currently use of like capitalistic speculations are actually destructive, right? The and is to transition to a different model. in which we are not engaging into those extractive practice and so forth. Now, the question, it's a very challenging question, is like, the means cannot justify the end, right? Like the means are determining the end. It's not like the way in which you choose to do one thing is actually affecting the thing.
Exactly.
Right? And so the question then is, if the end is to move away from that system, how do we get there? Right? And so one alternative is to actually say we should not feed at all this speculative capitalistic system that is actually contributing to harming the planet, because that means that we are giving it more strength while also hijacking it. So we are benefiting, but it's also benefiting, right? The alternative will be, well, no, we have to don't even interact with that. But then how do we get there, right? And so to me, there is always this question of transitioning, and like, how do we transition ethically in a way that it's a pity not to instrumentalize that system, because this system has so much power, so much capacity. It would be a pity not to use it as a trampoline to divert all of those resources, or not all of them, but a substantial amount of those resources into things that we think are important. But how do we do that without then getting stuck into that system? And while constantly keeping in mind that this is very only a transitionary path, and we really need to figure out the disconnection at some point. And so it's important, I think, to take as much as we can, divert as much as we can while it's there. But this is not the ultimate solution, because otherwise this means that we need speculation in order to divert energy into the environment, which is obviously not where the energy should come from. But given that we have it now, does that make sense to just waste it, as opposed to, if there is an opportunity of instrumentalizing and diverting it, shall we not do that in order to accelerate the transition, as long as we are conscious that there is always this danger that we should never get stuck into this model. This is not the final model.
It's not the final model, but I can't help but wonder, like, there's so much nuance to even the word speculate. Like, if I'm running a local cooperative seed saving organization and I see that, like, a lot of the farms in my local area have lost their pumpkin crops due to some sort of insect, and I have heirloom pumpkin seeds that are more disease resistant, and it's like, you know, maybe I don't sell all of them this season because I anticipate that next season they're going to be in higher demand. It's like, well, that might be a profitable thing for me to do because I can sell the seeds for more. There's higher demand for it. But I'm also, like, serving an ecological purpose because we're, you know, continuing the heirloom seeds. And it's like, where do we draw the lines between what's, like, is that speculation? Like, I'm speculating on the future, I'm taking in evidence, I'm forecasting, and, like, it feels like that aspect of human coordination and behavior and value exchange and decision making is not all wrong. And so somewhere there's kind of like, it goes into this area where we're like, well, this isn't part of the future. Like, what are those boundaries that we cross when we're like, no, we don't want to use the system like that until we've kind of achieved our aims? Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, like, when I talk about speculation, so I really mean, like, financial speculation, where you're creating an asset and you're purchasing this asset for the sole purpose of reselling it more expensively.
I see.
As opposed to speculating in terms of forecasting.
Right.
And so, yeah, there's
so it's like for investing in some sort of abstraction of a commodity, like, exactly, or asset, you're creating for the purpose of profiting from it.
Only for that, right? And there's no productive value as such to that. It's literally only buying to sell more expensively, as opposed to, I'm holding on because I know that maybe it will be needed later. And it's not just because I want to make profit. Collaterally, I make profit, that's great. But there is also a real reason why I'm doing this, which is not a speculative reason. I think the danger is when you have this pure speculative bubble that is only and exclusively fed by financial speculation.
And it seems like blockchain puts into hyperdrive the ability to create speculative representations.
Yes.
Like, because we can now tokenize and tokenize and tokenize and put all these layers, and it's programmatic and it's 24/7 and it's software, and like, so how do you feel about where blockchain is heading in this realm? And we have clear evidence in the last two bubbles.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's the blockchain technology will go exactly where society wants it to go. Because today our dominant system is capitalistic, speculative, financial speculation system. Of course, the technology will be instrumentalized for that. No doubt. It's normal. It's not the technology's fault. It's our system find a new technology. It's going to use it exactly to reinforce its own system. What's interesting is that the same technology can be used for very different reasons as well, which are perhaps more into the cooperative game, which are less into the extractivity and more into the generativity. The fact that we can create our token out of nothing, it's actually a very interesting thing because you can create like alternative economies, you can create subjective economies, you can create like a lot of different type of like mutual credit system that will be very complex to implement because you will need to extract value from somewhere in order to push it somewhere else, whereas here you can generate value, and if what you do actually has value in the eyes of others, then all of a sudden those tokens, that magic internet money, also become valuable because they are backed with an actual valuable item or services. So it's interesting to also look at how it provides new opportunities for alternatives. Those alternatives, in my view, have not been sufficiently explored. But they exist, and they are being explored. There is a lot of UBI systems that are being experimented with, which would be very hard to experiment with fiat, because where do you get the money to begin with? Whereas here, all of a sudden, well, let's create the money. If someone values it, there will be values assigned, right?
Yeah.
So I think there is like, and this is where I'm trying to dig, because I think the more we start exploring this, the more we actually understand that there are alternatives to the existing models. And instead of exacerbating the current model, I think the technology can also create a complementary or just an alternative model that, it's not about dominating everything, but at least providing ways for experimentation and exploration and letting people choose, I would rather play this game or I want to play board games. And then let's see which one eventually takes off.
Yeah. I love all that. I mean, that's been my experience. I had a conversation with Gregory Landouet, and we were talking about like, this is the space where we can participate. It's like you said, like the last place for experimentation. It's like there's this new set of tools that allows us to experiment in lots of different variations at a different velocity as well. And it's just possible, whereas a lot of the institutions in their current form are so impenetrable. I do think UBI is still like under discussed in blockchain. Like it feels like it's such a great use case for adoption, and it seems like we're hamstrung by this identity verification issue because it's too easy to essentially attack the system with a bunch of fake identities to get free money. But once we solve that, like it feels like we're going to be off to the races on a lot of different UBI experiments. What are you seeing in that field?
Yeah, so to me, it is a very interesting field because it has this dual type of experimentation, the economic UBI model and the identification model. There is a few projects. Well, maybe the most recent one is like Proof of Humanity, which has its own privacy questions, but which is trying to create this kind of like proof of personhood, and therefore one person, one vote, and therefore being able to accumulate UBI based on that. There are others that are more on Web of Trust model. There is Circles, which I think is very, very interesting, which is designed as a UBI, and actually by designing a UBI, they are somehow creating some kind of identification system because of the trust that people put into the people. And the circle one is very interesting because it's not really about, there's no objective token. Everyone has their own tokens. It's like personal tokens. So I generate my own UBI token, Primavera's tokens. they are all equal. So Matt's token are worth one Primavera token, but they don't have the same degree of liquidity, which is very interesting. And so it's not that Primavera tokens are more valuable in terms of value. They still are one-to-one. But if no one trusts me, I cannot exchange them. So no one accepts them, right? If you trust me, all of a sudden I have one gateway. So the people that trust you transitively also trust me because you trust me. And so it creates this very interesting model of like emergent UBI through the web of trust mechanism, which also show that if someone, because now you're putting an economic stake in trusting me, and so that means that if you trust me to be one person, then this could also be used as the amount of trust that I have could also be assigned a credential of how much of a single person I am as well, right? So in some way, like the UBI is pushing a lot of experimentation also in the proof of personhood, singularity, like singularity of identity type of research, which is very interesting as well. But yeah, there is an inherent need of identification, and no one, of course, wants to do KYC type of things. So you need to figure out those alternative mechanisms, which is usually based on trust and vouching and things like this.
Yeah, there's also Gitcoin Passport, which is trying to solve this in its own way. What do you think? I know privacy is very important to you. What do you think of WorldCoin and what they're doing with biometrics?
Yeah. I find the project slightly problematic by the way in which it is pretty much instrumentalizing poor populations in order to train their recognition model, AI model. I think it's very opaque in terms of like what data do they keep, what data do they not keep, and biometrics being such an important type of data, I think, I don't feel fully comfortable. I will not give them my iris.
You haven't looked into the orb yet for your free coins.
Yeah.
Okay, fascinating. Yeah, I tend to be a bit uneasy about it as well, and I guess opaque is the right word because it just there's not enough information shared to really get clear on certain aspects of it. Okay, so I want to talk also about what you're doing. I guess part of the edge of what you're working on right now, Overthrow the Network State. Network state, of course, being terminology that's been memed into existence by Balaji. Sorry, Balaji, if you're listening to this, we'd love to have you and talk to you about this, but we're going to provide the counter opinion at this stage. Why overthrow the network state?
Yes. So the network state is an interesting concept as a concept. I think I'm part of this small, I hope not too small, group of people that had high expectations about the book because the concept is kind of curious. It's interesting. What is a network state? Like we're all kind of like distributed communities, it's like, that sounds good. But then reading the book makes you feel a bit sad that this is the one instantiation of the network state that is proposed to the world, and that resonates a lot with people. My belief, my hypothesis is that people are resonating with the title, but not with the content of the book.
Right. And just so people have a basic understanding, like, we have nation state government structures today, and this idea that now the digital system as it is affords this new forms of organizing into networks that are across what currently exists as geographical borders into kind of networks. And those networks could also then take on place-based contexts in the future. Right. I hope I'm paying that justice, but that's kind of how I understand it.
Yeah, that's that. And then there is the important element of, and then we declare sovereignty.
Right.
And we
put a flag in the ground and say this is
we create our own state which has a distributed territory. And to me, what triggers me with this concept is that it's really it's really this exit-based type of governance in which it's okay to exit because we don't like something, and then we're actually recreating something. Like we're recreating a state. We don't like states, but let's create another state that is networked and that we are in control. So, and the problem is that it comes with this kind of, there is a beautiful narrative around the plurality and everyone can create their own money. Everyone should be able to create their own states. Why not? But the problem is that this plurality is also a competitive system, which is I'm exiting the state, I'm extracting value out of the state, I'm extracting my taxes, I'm extracting my citizens, and now what do? Now I have like a distributed type of things, but it's not, there's no more state that is controlling it because I declared independence. What do? I need to rebuild the whole state infrastructure from scratch. That's a lot of work. And so the idea, in my view, is that there is something very interesting in the fact that we, because of the internet, we are creating new forms of tribes with a very strong cultural identity, with a desire of collective action. And this is very in line with the network state as described by Balaji. The difference is what is the governance that we want those entities that I'm not going to call network state because it's not even a state in my view. So one thing is like, I think the exit-based approach to governance is a very naive belief that you can just exit and that there is no interdependencies after you've exited, which is basically moving away the internal politics into external geopolitics. Because now all of a sudden you have like a bunch of network states, they're actually close to each other. How do they interact, right? And so the idea of creating states which are made by very aligned individuals that don't need to discuss politics, well, then the politics happen on the borders. And you're just creating the same problem on the outside, but that's exactly, you're not solving the governance problem to begin with. And so there is that, and then there is so what's the governance that we want to implement? The way in which it's described in the book is very like centralized, top-down, founder, like startup model, right? It's like you have a startup, founder has a great idea, let's create a state, let's find funds, let's purchase territory, let's get population, and then let's reign as the new sovereign, as opposed to really understanding the interdependencies. And so overthrowing the network state is the concept of saying, well, let's actually identify, it's like mimetic warfare. Let's identify an alternative concept that taps into the same underlying resonance of how do we help communities engage, acquire agency, engage in collective action, engage in the shared management of resources, right? Because I think there is a point in which it's not enough to be an online community. We already have a lot of online community. We have a lot of local communities. How do we actually organize in a way? How do we provide the necessary infrastructure, which doesn't need to be a state-like infrastructure? So what I'm trying to elaborate with this whole work towards overthrowing the network state is, can we move away from, the network is a great word, but can we move away from the notion of statehood? Because statehood inherently means that you have two separate states that are competing or that are like disconnected and not interdependent, into a more like layered approach in which the focus is not on the state but on the nation. Is like the fact that particular communities identify themselves through a very strong self-determination, cultural identity, belonging. And so it starts to feel like a nation. It might be a small nation, micronation, but it starts to feel like a nation. There is shared values, there is a shared societal vision, and so forth. And so how do we then coalesce and bring resources together through an infrastructure that ideally transcends from the infrastructure of the state and doesn't replicate it? And that's where I think blockchain technologies becomes interesting because they transcend national boundaries. And so you can actually enable those fragmented and networked type of communities that recognize themselves potentially as a proto-nation to engage together, to share resources, to engage into like general interest, public good, etc., as an overlay on top of existing states, where the state is the landlord and should stay as the landlord. That's very hard task that they have
So
to
rather
do.
than atomizing down a layer from the state and saying, okay, we've found our online community of like-minded people, let's all move to a piece of land, buy it, put the boundaries up. We have enough capital that we raised in our network state ICO, and now we're going to put our flag in, declare sovereignty, create our own rules, our own haven, where we're going to be able to experiment in our autonomous zone. What you're saying is no. Like, the state is the landlord, and there's too many interdependencies here to realize that at some sort of replicable scale. And what we really should be thinking is a layer above the state is how does, assisted by blockchain technology, how do we as people unite on values and shared norms and systems of governance, and get more intelligent about things like shared common resources, but still maintaining the current state structure.
And actually supporting the state.
And supporting the state.
Because oftentimes, like, the state is doing as well as they can to support their citizen, but sometimes it's not enough. And so citizen, it's kind of like, you have the market, and then you have the private sector, you have the public sector. We don't have much third sector, right? Like civil society. Like, how do we get civil society to self-organize and to actually try and accommodate its own needs and the need of others, right? And I think there is so much opportunities to identify solutions that are complementary to the solution that the state is providing, but you don't want to exit, because then you lose everything that the state is already providing. You lose the interdependence. You lose the whole concept of citizenship, right? Like, you don't want to become your own citizen in your own state.
Right.
You want to have a multiplicity of nationality, which are not necessarily related to a state. I can be French and I can be part of the whatever the name of this community is, and that's my dual nationality. And I would love that I can support this nation, whether it's digital or physical. And I think the fact that those communities, of course, are also oftentimes anchored in some places. But the point is not to put the flag and say, this is an autonomous, independent, sovereign state. It's just, this is the place in which this community gather. And then you can have multiple embassies, and then you can travel the world, and you have always some people from your nation that you can encounter, and which have a particular system of identification, which have a particular system of resource management and so forth, and collective action, in addition to what already exists at the state level. And that doesn't mean I'm not going to pay taxes anymore. It just means that now I might need to pay more taxes because I want to pay taxes for this additional infrastructure.
Yeah, it does feel like the network state fits a little too neatly into some of those same impulses of like, I want to grow a company. No, I want to grow a country. And, I want to like exit my tax jurisdiction and remove myself from this place because I don't like to pay so many taxes, or, the system's so fucked up, I'm just running away from it. And yeah, there is no away. Like, we're all on this journey together, and like the interdependence is here. And if there's nothing else that, the poly crisis is here to teach us, it's like that we're all in this ship together. And so having, like uber rich tech elites move into autonomous zones where they buy recognition of sovereignty from poor nation states who are indebted to then extract their tax dollars into some faraway jurisdiction so that they can experiment with smart contracts in novel ways and not pay tax. Like, it's not the world that we want to create. I haven't really dug into network state as much as I should, but my lens on it has been predominantly that we just don't talk nearly enough about land and ecology. In a lot of these conversations in this series, people are thinking much more about the organizational unit at the bioregion or watershed level. It's like if we feel like we need to reconfigure nation states, it's how do we reconfigure much more along nature's natural contours. And because those ecological bodies are what's going to anchor our coordination in ways that fundamentally matter, already do, but it's going to be very much so as well in the future, because we're going to be dealing with things like mass displacement of populations, and we've taken for granted some of those ecosystem functions that we won't be able to take for granted anymore. So we're going to have to unite with our neighbors around how do we restore watersheds, or how do we restore food landscapes, or how do we resettle into areas that weren't previously inhabited, or vice versa. And so, I do think that there's an interesting meta layer of where blockchain can really fit within that conversation as well. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, and to me, this is the problem today, is that nation states are actually already too separate, and we don't realize the interdependency that exists amongst literally every place on Earth, right? And it's difficult. You cannot let one state in one place operate in unconditionally and irrespectively of what's happening in the rest of the world. And so to me, in fact, those coordinations, those virtual digital networked communities that have action, that have collective action and resources, they can actually contribute to doing the job of interdependencies that nation state, because of their secluded physicality, have a hard time doing, right? And to me, this is very interesting if we create a particular decentralized distributed nation which have resources, which manage to somehow engage into some kind of activity, and then also supporting or not supporting, subsidizing even the state in order to do things because they understand, because they are in multiple places in the world. They understand interdependencies better.
Right.
And so instead of actually further fragmentalizing into even small units that will have even harder time to deal with global coordination, to me there is so much more value in actually empowering those digital community that understand the interdependency because they are interdependent, and seeing how those community can feed off and feed back to the geographically secluded nation states. Right. And I think it connects back to impact NFT, EcoCoin, and things like this. Is you can create those layers, and in this case you are creating non-speculative, but you're creating those abstract layers that then can feed back into reality. Right. And I think just as an example to show the connection is you can imagine, for instance, some type of impact NFTs that are digital contraption, but that are associated with real land, and all of a sudden, whatever is the economy that is operating on this metaverse layer is inherently associated with a real piece of land, and so all of a sudden, by purchasing those NFTs or those assets, those digital assets, you are also investing into a physical resources, and the natural vitality of these natural resources will enhance the profit and therefore the economic value of this metaverse, but vice versa. The value of the metaverse is also feeding back into the physical, and I think to me there is this interesting symbiosis. It can also, depending on how it is designed, it can turn into a utopia or a dystopia. But there is a symbiotic possibility of actually merging the digital and virtualized reality with the physical. And to me, this is what we need to focus on. This is how it makes sense today to leverage those digital technology, is to create those bridges between the digital and the physical so that they can feed into each other.
Yeah, 100% agree. And going back to what you said too about the ability for a maybe a blockchain-enabled coordination group to see in a more transcendent way above nation-state borders, because it has different contexts in different places. I feel like that describes the power of current multinational corporations effectively. Like, we have evidence that, there are, multinational corporations are often much more powerful than nation states, right? Because they do rest in many jurisdictions. And so what you're suggesting is something that could look more like that, but hopefully organized by different logic.
Without the profit maximizing approach of a private actor.
Right. So Overthrow the Network State, you're doing a podcast series on this, right? Tell me more about that.
Yeah, basically, it started kind of randomly, but I guess it's grabbing quite some traction right now. The idea is like, we started thinking about those things, but we of course are not expert in all those aspects. And so the idea is to kind of starting by just poking at like what we consider to be the flaws of the Network State book, but then slowly evolving into actually like interviewing people that are really thinking about alternatives. And the idea is really to create like an alternative, I don't know if it's the movement is the right word, but an alternative meme that, because it's very interesting actually how the publication of the Network State actually triggered a lot of initiatives that are now trying to instantiate a network state. And so the idea with the podcast is to kind of like create traction and elaborate this alternative vision, which we currently call coordinations, but again, lack of a better word. And actually eventually co-author an alternative book with like lots of people, kind of Wikipedia style, in which everyone can contribute their thoughts about like how do we actually instantiate these coordinations type of things, knowing that there is so many digital communities that are actually craving to do that. I think we reached a point in which the internet has shown us that digital community can be very powerful. And now I think the blockchain is starting to show us, it's basically if DAOs actually get to work, that those digital communities can actually acquire their own governance structure, their own economic structure, and really engage and actually have impact in the broad sense of impact. It becomes possible to go beyond just being a community. And I think it's really like you can extrapolate, right? You have like the traditional nation state on the one side, you have the digital community, very loose, on the other side. And then how do you extrapolate amongst them? Network state being somewhere here. And then we kind of want to figure out what's there. It's like a little bit more structured, a little bit more engaging into shared resources, etc., without having to go into the whole institutional framework of the state, but maintaining these institutional dynamics while also implementing a little bit of institutional scaffoldings that can augment the capacity for action and coordination that existing online community lack.
Awesome. Well, we'll link in the show notes to the podcast. You also did an episode with Owaki on Green Pill around coordination. So we'll put a link to that as well. My favorite quote, which you knew I had to include in your Twitter, someone wrote, "Counterculture to the counterculture is some elite hipster shit." Papa Wasi was the wonderful originator of that. It is interesting, like for someone on the outside, like having a counter argument to something that's still so niche may seem crazy, but I do think Balaji's hit a nerve, and it does seem like this meme is here to stay, and it's being shepherded and heralded by many in the crypto community, and I think it points to just so many different impulses and motivations that are shared and often, I think good and well-intentioned. And so now we get to kind of open the discourse about what does this mean, and what are the experiments, and what are the flaws and the pros and cons of different approaches.
Yeah, and on that level, I'm actually very grateful to Balaji, because Balaji has really created this interesting hype around a concept that was very little discussed and which didn't have an ontological reference. And so now we have this concept in the air and everyone is talking about it. And now it's fantastic because I don't think if I would have managed to create this big wave, but now that the big wave is there, we can surf on the wave of Balaji in order to, again, hijack it and try to bring it, at least provide an alternative path so that people can choose which type of infrastructure will they rather play with.
Yeah, and hopefully just improve our collective coordination from here. Are there any questions I didn't ask or anything else that you wanted to discuss?
I think that's plenty.
Okay, well, thank you so much for your time, Primavera. It's been a real pleasure.
My pleasure.
I really appreciate Primavera's emphasis on shifting from competition to cooperation. And when she was talking about impact NFTs, I couldn't help but think we're going to see a lot more experiments in the field of NFTs in the future. I also liked when she was offering her critique of the network state, of how she characterized it as an exit-based approach to governance, and suggests instead that we take a more layered approach, almost like a nation. And what I like about this is that it recognizes what came before rather than just trying to push away the current system. I know some people are trying to frame this as coordinations, so we'll see if that sticks. Ultimately, what I resonate with Primavera the most around is this core philosophy of interdependence. If you like this conversation, you might also want to check out the ones we did with Jessie Kate Shingler of Embassy Network and Open Lunar, as well as Jessica Flor Angel of Faye and Tony Lai. You can find all of that and more at maearth.com. Please like, share, subscribe, and leave us a comment below. Thanks for tuning in, and I'll see you next time.